React state, which is probably the single most important concept of React. Without React state, nothing happens in React. Nothing. Websites or sites don't do a thing. They just become static sites. So we'll do a quick review. We'll talk about components, JSS, and props, the three usual suspects that we like to talk about to begin with, a bit of a review, and then we'll talk a bit about React functional components and what that really means. And we'll do a quick preview or review of JavaScript functions. Way back in week 2, we talked about JavaScript functions, a little bit on closures. Has anybody heard this term closures before in JavaScript? It's an interesting one. It used to be part of the curriculum. I think they took it out, which is too bad because it's a fascinating topic. And I'll show you some few closures because this is what React is based on. In fact, this is what React and jQuery and all the libraries are based on, are this thing called closures. They're kind of fun to play with, and they behave in kind of fun ways. And we'll talk about the component lifecycle and the term render. You're going to hear this term all the time. Render. Oh, the component rendered. What does that mean? We hear all these words, this jargon in this business, but it's good to know what those things mean. Then we'll talk about actual state and, of course, the use state hook. Now, I believe you've done some exercises already using state and use state. So this is a bit of a review, but we'll dive a lot deeper into just how it works and why it works. A bit of a quiz, maybe a game show quiz. Why did they call it React? Talk about that for a second. We'll talk about this concept of stale state. Yes, state can go stale, just like the bread on my counter there. Yeah. We'll talk about how we share state between components and how we can have sibling components that aren't in a parent-child relationship, still share state. And we'll briefly touch on this. We'll talk about this more on Thursday when I talk about some best practices. But we'll touch on this a little bit right today as well. All right, so let's talk about a few really simple things, okay? So we are dealing with today React. Now, I do an awful lot of interviews. Unfortunately, when you get to my point in the career, they grab you for interviews. Like, Gary, interviews, like, oh, another one? Okay. Stop your project and go interview somebody. You want to do your best, and because you may be working with this person. So I tend to take a different approach to interviews. I find a lot of interviewers are lazy. They just make you do some code questions. Yeah, solve this problem and come back when you're done. I don't do that. I tend to avoid doing quiz questions or code challenge questions because that's the lazy way out. Anybody can go online and memorize questions or practice over and over again. I tend to talk about more concepts with developers, more of a conversation. For example, React lets us build components. So it builds, put capital C. So React lets us build components. In other words, it is component based. Okay. Well, first interview question. If I'm talking to somebody and they say, well, I'm a React developer, I'll say, great. I've heard that React builds components. Can you tell me what a component is? What is a component? There is a definition. What is the definition? Is a component. Now we're talking, of course, functional components, not class components. So we'll talk about functional components. Well, what is a component? Very innocent sounding question. What is it? Always wondered, what is a component in React? Well, let's take a look. I've got a little app. You probably talked yesterday about stripping down the Create React app template they give you. I've done that here, right? I've taken all this stuff out, taken my public out. I've really got just a basic app. I've got a really stripped down index HTML. There's my div with my root right there. The only thing I need, right? And I've got my index.js, very small. That's all I need there. And I've got my app.js. So the only really essential files are the index.js, index.html, and my app.js, but even that's not really necessary. We know that because we could always put things in index, but we tend to like to start with this app.js file is our starting point as developers. So we start here. Our work starts here. So this app is a component. Okay, so what is a component? Now, I think Andy said this too. I don't ask trick questions. Okay, so app is a component. What is app? Anyone tell me, what is app? If this was week 2 and I asked you, what is app? You could probably tell me. So what is app? Starts with F. It's a function.
Function.
Exactly, yes. Okay, app is a function, so that's a great start. So we know that, first off, it is a function. But it's not just any function. I mean, if I write a function here, call it my function that console logs hello. Well, that's not a component, is it? I mean, I could put a capital M because that's convention, but just giving something a capital letter doesn't make that a component. So this function is not a component, is it? No, clearly. So it must be something else about this function that makes it a React component. Anyone know what that is? Yes, thank you, Dylan. Exactly. Returns JSX. Exactly right. So a React component is a function that returns JSX. That is the definition of a React component. I ask that question in interviews all the time. So they can't tell me. I've always wondered, what's a component? And sometimes I get like just crickets. I don't know. Or it's a thing in a page that you can like divide into pieces. And it's like, no, it's a function that returns JSX. Great to know what you're talking about. In this business, you probably heard the term imposter syndrome, right? And we all experience that. The best way to avoid imposter syndrome is to not be one, to know what you're talking about, know the basics of what you're talking about. A lot of the stuff isn't hard. So a component is a function that returns JSX. That's the definition. Great interview question. Okay. Okay. So I guess the next question is, as part of our conversation, the obvious question is, well, what is JSX? What is JSX? Go to app. So there's some JSX. Now that's pretty simple JSX, right? It looks like HTML, doesn't it? And in this state, it is pretty much pure HTML, but it's not. It is actually markup. It's the React markup language, which is kind of a combination of JavaScript plus HTML. In other words, it's the template language for React. There. Oops, HTML. So that is JSX. And we know that we can, in our app, make ourselves another function. I can make a function here. I'll call it title. There. It's a function. It is not yet a React component, is it? So how would I make a React component? Well, I'd return some JSX. Simple enough. Return and round braces, just a fragment there. So there is the world's simplest React component, a function that returns JSX. You've heard about fragments, right? These empty things, they do not render. So we can use them anywhere just to overcome that must have a single parent rule in JSX. So there's a title. I can make it say something. I can make it do this. Maybe instead I'll put my H2 inside that. There. So there's my Hello React world. Like, oh, so Hello React. title. There. Or state. Even better, since that's the topic of today's talk. Hello React state. So there is my component. It looks like it renders. We'll talk about that term later. Hello React state. And we know that I can now use this component inside my other component. In other words, the parent component. So instead of that, I can now go pointy bracket that thing, right? Title, just like that. And I can use my title and I get hello React state. Okay. We know that's the Webpack and the bundler and the WebSocket's actually changing live. We don't have to refresh. Occasionally we have to. Sometimes it gets confused. You have to sometimes hit refresh, not often, but sometimes you get in a state where it really gets confused on you. So if you see some really strange stuff on your screen, just refresh. It might go away. Okay, because it might not be your fault. So there, I've essentially called that function, right? So this is a function. And I'm not kidding, it really is a function. In fact, I could do this. Instead of doing that, I'll just comment that for now. I could do this. We know that in JSX, if we want to embed some JavaScript, we use pointy brackets, don't we? I could say title. I can call that component as a function. Does that work? Yes. Same thing. I'm just calling it as a function now. This is exactly the same as this. Let's keep that there for now. So now I'm calling this component as a function. Now I can also pass parameters to my function. It's just a function. You're going to hear me say this today a lot of times. You can count the number of times Gary says it's just a function, and it behaves just like a function. It can't do anything else but behave like a function. That's important. Oftentimes we lose sight of the fact that a React component is just a function, and we somehow think it has these extra superpowers. We can do special things, and it can't. It's just a function. So I can call my function. I can call my function with a parameter, right? I can say, hello, React. It's a function. I can pass any parameter I want. I'm going to pass a string, which means I can give my parameter to my component function. It's just a function. And I can put my text in here. Now this is JSX. I have to use curly braces, but that works. And I get hello React. Of course, it's just a function. There's nothing here we don't know already. We can call a function, we can give it a parameter, it accepts a parameter, and we use the parameter. Totally no surprise. Okay. Now, what if I want to pass two parameters to my function? Well, just pass two parameters. It's easy. Pass another one. I have no imagination. Hey, okay. I envy guys like Andy and Kristen with these imaginations. They can think of all these cool things. I have zero imagination. I'm an engineer, right? So I have no imagination. Okay. So hey, so now my function takes two parameters. So let's give a second parameter. Text2. There. And why don't we make another H2? We'll put our text2 there. And no surprise, we see both of them. Of course, it's just a function. Title, two parameters, there we go. Nothing surprising here, is there? Okay. So we can pass more than one function or parameter to a function. We know that. But what if I want to only pass text2 to my function? I don't want to have to pass like an empty string, and I want that to be there. And I don't want to have a first one. So I can pass, of course, I can pass an empty string as the first one, or maybe an undefined or something like that. And I just want to use text2, but I've got that text. So this works, right? But what if I've got like a whole bunch, like there's just 30 parameters in this function? There is an easier way to pass multiple parameters to a function, isn't there? Which way is that? What's an easier way? Someone tell me? What do you think? Want to pass more than one thing to a function. Well, how about something like an object or an array? They hold more than one thing. So I can pass an object. So let's go ahead and pass an object instead. And the object has my text, hello text, my first one, and has my text 2, hello React. Okay, so there's my function with a single parameter. That's an object. Stuff we did back in week 1 and week 2. So now, of course, now my function now takes an object, only a single object. So now I have to go obj dot text2, don't I? Because it's an object, and that the same thing? Yeah, to be sure. Hello React state, just to make sure it's working on us. And yeah, it's working fine. So I'm passing an object to my title function. There's my parameter, obj, and I use obj.text2. Pretty simple stuff. Just a function. What if 10 times already? It'll get more than that. Okay. Okay, so this is fine, but we don't normally call a component this way. We could, but it would be very rare we do this. We normally call it using, of course, pointy brackets, don't we? Pointy braces. Like this. We go title. There. That's what we usually do with pointy brace. We call our title, and of course, doesn't render because it has no text. So we need to pass the parameters to it. Now, we can't do this. We can't pass these parameters because this is now what's called XML or markup. And the XML language, which actually is a thing, the XML language, of which HTML is a flavor of, as is JSX, has certain syntax, and this is not it. You can't pass parameters that way. Of course, we pass parameters using key value pairs, don't we? So we go title, text equals hello world, space, text2 equals, like this. And that's how we pass parameters in the XML language, in this case, JSX. So name, value, name, value. Okay, right, and it renders. These two are identical. In fact, we've heard about Babel, right? The transpiler. I love that word, transpiler. Sounds like it should be a big truck turning into a robot. Transpiler, more than meets the eye. Oh, never mind. Okay, old cartoon. Okay, so the transpiler converts this into this. This is exactly what Babel does. It takes this code and turns it into this function call. So we're just doing what transpiler does. Okay. Of course, we don't do that. So I'll comment that. We normally call it this way. So get rid of this one. So this is how we're going to be calling our component functions from now on in JSX. And this is what JSX is. It's the markup language that lets us, of course, have HTML, but also call other components. Great. Right. So that's really a brief overview of JSX and, of course, props, because as you know, we call it OBJ, but we don't normally call it OBJ. We call it, of course, you probably guessed, we call it props. As convention. You can call it anything you want. You can call it OBJ, but really you're going to see props. And if you call it something else, anybody looking at your code is going to kind of get confused. So I would certainly want to stick to props. We call it props, but it's the same thing. Props dot text2, props dot text, and it works fine. So let's just change this. I don't want one of these, so I'll just call this my props dot text, and there's my props dot text. So it's the left side of the equal sign that is important with props. Okay, and we do, I believe we're starting our first exercise. If it's not today, I think it's tomorrow. Have we started the Photo Labs exercise yet? I believe it starts today or tomorrow. It's a much bigger React app, and we do a lot of props. There is like props calisthenics in that particular app. And sometimes the props change names as they work down the tree. But they're just the object that you built using this, which we know is just an object that Babel creates for us in our function call, right? So let's take a look at something else. Let's take a look at functions, because this is key to how React does its thing. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to render something else. Let's render ourselves a count. I'll go let count equals 0. I believe, I think Andy's mentioned as well, I think in every single lecture, it is mandatory to have at least one count. So we'll have a counter in this one as well. And I'm going to render my count right here. We know that I can curly brace count. There. And I should see my 0. There it is. No surprise. Okay. So let's take a bit of a sidebar and look at functions. I'm going to make a little file here. I'm going to call it, I'll call it functions for now. New file. .js. I'm putting it outside my source just to make sure I don't maybe compile it by mistake. Okay. All right. I can make a function, can't I? So log that console log. So hello. Let's wrap that in a function. I've got some snippets. Has anybody heard of snippets in VS Code? They are awesome. I've got some snippets. Go File, Preferences, User Snippets. I've got one for make a function in JavaScript. There we go. So I type in fn, just makes a named function. I've got some other ones, cool React ones. We'll talk about these more, but you can do some really cool. I've got some it blocks, describe blocks. I love snippets. They're the coolest thing. They save you a lot of work. Okay. So there's my function. I'll call it my function. No imagination, right? There's my function. So I can say hello inside my function. There. Let's call my function. What does it do? Node does nothing because it's no executable code. It's declaring a function, or technically it is declaring a variable that references a function. We know this is a functional expression. We talked about this earlier, right? Where we have a variable equals, and there's the function right there. So to call the function, since I've got a functional expression, I can just simply say my function. There, real easy. It works, okay? And call my function. There we go. Works fine. Let's change my function. Let's go let count equals 0. There. We'll go hello count. And I should get hello 0. Once again, no surprise. I'll put a colon, make it look nice formatting. That's the limit of my formatting. Okay. Something else. Let's go. Why don't we do count plus plus? Oops. There, I'll put it here. What do I expect to see? Well, I expect to see hello 1. I'm going to call it a couple of times. There. Okay. Let me call my function 5 times. But I'm getting 5 ones. But I'm sure I call plus plus. What's happening? Why am I getting 1 all the time? Of course, this is obvious, right? It's a brand new function, isn't it? So every time I invoke this function, I'm getting a new instance of, and this is important jargon, this whole terminology of invoke and instance. So when I call my function, I am creating an instance of this function. There it is. And it runs. It makes a new count. It increments that count, and it console logs hello in that count. I call the function again. It's a different instance of that function, which means it does everything again from scratch. It doesn't reuse the last instance. It can't do that. it's all new. So every time I call this function, everything is new. It's all brand new. Nothing gets remembered from. In other words, nothing survives the next invocation from the previous invocation. They're all new. Now, this is intuitive, makes sense intuitively, right? We know that we're going to get 5 ones, okay? But what if I did something a little different? What if I did this? What if instead make a little function called increment, and I put this inside here. There. Okay. And when I call my function now, call it 5 times, well, I get nothing at all. Well, of course, because now increment, of course, is now just a variable that is assigned to a function. So I should do something with it. Well, I'll just return it. Let's return increment. There. Okay. And one of these. There. Const result equals. I'll just log what I get back from this function. Okay, run it again. Well, I got back the function increment. That's interesting. So I ran my function. It returns the function, and I get a function. This is kind of the reverse of a callback, isn't it? Remember callbacks? Where we pass a function as a parameter here. But now this is the opposite. We're now returning a function from a function. This is called a closure. And it is a very important concept in JavaScript. And you might get asked this on an interview because I asked this question. What's a closure? Pretty simple. It's just a function that returns a function. A little more to it than that, but that's an acceptable answer. A function that returns a function. There, you got a closure. Okay. If your function returns an inner function, you can call it the inner function. Sometimes you call this the outer function, inner function, but that's just jargon. It's a function that returns another function. And as you can see, it does. Well, I've got a function. What do we do with functions? Anyone? What's the only thing we do with them? So one thing we do with the function, what do we do with it? We call it, right? That's all we can do. We call the function. So say result. There. I'm going to call result. Hello 1. Makes sense, right? Do it a couple more times. So 4 times I'm going to call result. There. What do we expect to see? Who wants to take a guess? What am I expect to see from this? If I call result, I'm going to invoke this function 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now that's interesting. What happened there? Didn't we just say that nothing survives the invocation? I invoked my function here, and it's finished. My function finished. But we just said that nothing survives after a function finishes. When it's done, and that's true, once the function finishes, everything disappears, except in the case of a closure. If there's a closure in force or closure present, what happens is stuff sticks around. The count is still in play because JavaScript knows that it's returning this function, and this function references that count, so it keeps this thing alive. So I can call this 4 times and I get 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's a closure. And they're fascinating constructs in JavaScript, and we use them everywhere without even knowing about it. We use them in jQuery all the time. We didn't even know it, and we use them all the time. A function inside a function. When you call it later, you can reference this, count this in scope. Okay, there is a technical definition of a closure. It's pretty complex. Talks about lexical scope, whatever that means. But really, it's just a function that returns a function, and anything that inner function references is still in play, is still alive. It survives the initial call of this. Okay, so this is cool. I like closures. They're pretty cool things. Let's try it again, though. Let's call this, make it a let this time. I'm going to call it again. There. Or call, oops, there we go. There we go. Okay. Nope. The question is, are closures unique to JavaScript? No, they're not. They are present in other languages as well. Yeah, many of the languages have closures. They're just more obvious in JavaScript because JavaScript is a kind of a scripting language. Okay, so now I'm going to call result again. Okay, so now result the first time, we don't need that console log anymore. We know it was a function. And then I'm going to call my function again. Okay. Let's place our bets. What are we going to expect to see? We expect to see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Get everyone to vote A or B. Door number 1 is 1, 2, 3, 4 twice. Door number 2 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Got kind of a spread. Take a look. Let's take a look. All right. All right, let's give it a try. We get 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the reason for that is we called the main function again. And we know that this function was called a second time. And when this happens, everything else gets wiped out, or this is a new instance of my function. So it doesn't remember this instance of the function. Let's do something even more fun. Just for fun, it's kind of optional. I go result 2 and result 1 and 1, 2, 2, 2, 2. There, run this again. We get the 2 1 to 4s. What if I called result 1 again? It's going to happen. I do get the 5, 6, 7, 8. So this is still alive. This is one instance of the function. This is, remember classes and objects, the same thing. We create a new object, and we can create 2 objects using the same template, if you will. Well, functions really are classes, or technically classes are functions in JavaScript. Classes, as we know, don't exist. They're fake. They're totally an artificial illusion in JavaScript. JavaScript doesn't have classes. It has functions. It's just some sugar-coated wrapping they've added this class keyword in JavaScript to make it pretend to have classes. They're just functions, okay? And this is what's happening. We're invoking one and making a second one. But these 2 instances don't know anything about each other, okay? Now, for our purposes, all we care about is this. There. Oh, let's just change this back to result. There we go. Okay. So what's happening here is, of course, the second invocation doesn't remember anything from the first instance of the function. Nothing survived, okay? I'm still referencing it, so it could still be used, but this is a brand new instance. I am invoking or running my function again, so count goes back to 0. Even though I put all the way to 4 there, called it 4 times, but then when I ran it again, it got reset back to 0. Let's do the same thing in React. Let's actually grab this, grab all this code, do the very same thing. Take this and put it right there. There, same code exactly. So I got my app, which still works. Okay, double check my DevTools. Of course, the best way to call DevTools is pressing the F12 key on your keyboard. F12, it takes you back to the same spot. You can go right-click inspect if you want, but I reserve that when I actually want to inspect something, because now I have to change tabs. It's kind of annoying. So I just use the F12 key. It's way faster. It takes you back to where you were before. right? So we'll go to the console, F12. Okay. So let's go ahead. Now I want to weigh, now this is a closure, isn't it? I've got this closure, increment. I need a way to call my closure. Now, of course, I can't run this in Node. I have to have a way to invoke this increment. So we're going to use a button. Make myself a button here. There. And I'll make a handler on click equals, and I will call my increment function. Okay. And I'll put a plus sign right there. Okay. Now I'm calling increment. And let's look at our logs. In fact, we're going to get with console log hello count. Sounds good. So we press our plus button. We get hello 1, hello 2. Look at this. Hello 3. But strangely enough, it's not rendering. Now, we know this from before, right? It doesn't render my 1, 4, although it's 6. Count is clearly 6 now, but it's still showing as 0 on my browser. So now we're getting to the heart of React. The question is, why? Why am I not getting 6? It's clearly 6. I can see 6. Yeah. Now it's 11. Why is this not displaying on my browser? There's kind of 2 reasons. But yeah, maybe add a hook for dynamic updated state. Yeah, possibly. Yep, that'd be a great thing. Let's talk about why it doesn't display. The main thing is because it's not rendering. It's the screen or the browser is not changing. There's nothing to tell React to render, right? It's not rendering. You hear this term all the time, rendering. It's not rendering. And this is a common problem in React. You go like, why isn't it showing on my browser? It's nothing there. It's not rendering. One of the most common requests we get as mentors. Why is my screen not rendering? I'm changing something that's not rendering. Okay. So clearly this 11 is not rendering. Okay, well, back to our interview questions then. What is render? So we use these terms. We should know what we're talking about. What are we talking about? What does render mean? Here's all the time. You hear instructors mention it has to render. What does that mean? Render, really? What is displaying the DOM? The virtual DOM? Yep, that sounds good. That's what a render does. But what is a render? It has those effects, displaying the DOM and up. Yep, it does. That is the effect of a render. That is the result of a render. But what is a render? And this is crucially important. One of those, if you forget everything else from today, remember what a render is. Well, let's go back. In fact, let's take a look. Let's word the question differently, okay? What is a React component render? There, slightly different question. Let's analyze the question. So, React component render. This looks like a verb, doesn't it? Verb means to render, right? Render now, render later, to render. It looks like a verb. Okay, so React component verb. So React component does something. Okay, let's go back to our very first question. What is a component? Who knows? Who can answer that now? What is a component? It's a function, isn't it? A React component is a function. Okay, so what is a function? There. Verb, which is to do something. So what does a function do? Well, since we know that a React component is a function, there can be only one answer to that question. What's the only thing we can do with functions? The only thing. There's only one thing we can do. App is a function. Yeah, call them. Exactly, call them. You run the function. That's a render. Because a React component is a function, it couldn't be anything else but to just call the whole thing from top to bottom. It's a function. That's a render. We lose sight of this fact, but try to remember this. A render is literally top to bottom, running the whole thing over again, every line of code. So if I render app, I run line 16, let count equals 0. I then create a new function called increment. Old one's gone. This is a new instance of app, right? I'm invoking much with my function. I call it again. Everything got forgotten, didn't it? It's the same with my app. I run it again. I return a whole new DOM or a whole new JSX. Other stuff's gone. It disappeared. I'm building a brand new virtual DOM, at least from app down, from scratch. And then I return that. That is a render. Okay. Well, let's ask the question then. Let's say I could somehow magically, inside my increment function, call some render, which I won't do because please don't do that. Please don't call that. Okay. So I had some magical render function that I could force a render to happen. Okay. And I clicked my plus button. What would happen? Well, I would render, wouldn't I? I would call my entire function from top to bottom. What's the first line of code? Count equals 0. So even if I could magically render my component, I would still see 0, no matter what I did, because that's the first line of code. Just like my function here, my count equals 0. So looks like I can't win. Okay, even if I could render, I'm still in trouble. I cannot render that 0. And the reason is because the count didn't survive the last render. Nothing survives a render. So remember that. Nothing survives a render. Well, there must be a way to make something survive, because how could we, clearly I should be able to make that count go to 1. So how can we make something survive a render? No local variables survive. Anything local here doesn't survive. And we know that there is a React hook that is specifically designed for things to survive a render. It is, of course, everyone, use state. Exactly. The reason this lecture. State, exactly. Use state. So we don't declare it this way. We know this already. We'd go const, and we'd say usually this count equals use state, because the use state function returns an array with 2 things in it. Returns the previous thing you saved, and it also gives you back a function called, well, you can call it whatever you want, but usually we name it like this: set, then the same thing. It's just convention. Something and set something is the way we usually structure these things. Okay. And you can give it an initial value. If you don't, you get undefined. Okay, well, we'll try that in a second as well. So there's use state. This is simply called array destructuring, which you should know by now. By the way, I asked that in interviews. What is destructuring of an array or an object? You'd be surprised how many people that have resumes that say senior dev, just, I get like Homer Simpson, just, like what? Exactly. So nice to know some of the things, know what you're talking about. And these are simple concepts. So count and set count just sets these variables to the result of this. So these are 2 brand new variables that I declare on this line. So I declare a variable called count and a variable called set count. My use state will put the last thing I saved into count, which will of course be 0 now. Okay. We'll try to run it now. Watch what happens. And not defined. So let's do this. There's a cool trick, by the way. Watch this in React. I'm going to type use, and I can start typing, and it pops up that and also auto imports. I love that feature. Okay. So we can go control space and do that. It will auto import for you. I'm really lazy with my imports, and I think the most common error I have is forget the imports because I am so lazy. Okay. Okay. So there's my use state. Okay, let's take a look. And about to find, let's take a look now. Plus, oh, invalid assignment to const count on line 18. Count plus plus. Oh yeah. Well, of course, now count is a constant. We always make them constants. I could do this, but that'd be a very bad thing. So they should always be const. State variables should not change inside your code here. That's kind of a crucial React concept. We'll talk more about it tomorrow, but here's my count. Counts there. So now, so instead of count plus plus, I'm going to call use state to count plus 1, like this. There. And now I can take a look at my code. Take a look. Is called in function increment. Oh, that's set count. There. Okay. And now it does what it's supposed to do. Now, kind of a long-winded way to make a counter, wasn't it? Okay. But I want to touch on all these important concepts, like what's a render? Why do we have state? Because things don't survive. Back in the day, when all we had were class components, okay, or technically only class components could have state. Functional components, although people think they're new, they're not. They always existed in React. They just couldn't save state. They were called, in fact, they were referenced or referred to as stateless components back pre-2019. So a stateless React component was a functional component. Now, of course, that's changed now. Now functional components can now hold state, and everyone changed. It was like, wow, everyone switched because it was such a huge deal, okay? So now I have a function component. All right, so that's really the key to use state. It is so things can survive a render, like my count. We talked earlier about what happens if I don't give this an initial value. What am I going to get now? Let's clear my console. What am I going to see? Well, I get nothing. Let's take a look. What is my, let's console log. Console log my count. What is count? Count is undefined. In fact, this is kind of fun. Let's actually put a render here. Let's put log rendering app, because we know that a render is run the whole function. So if I put that there, it'll means this is rendered there. So press my page, rendering app, and then count is undefined. So if you give no parameter to use state, you're getting undefined. Usually we give it something. There are some cases where I actually want undefined, but here I don't, because if I do plus, I'm going to get what? I'm going to get nan, because I'm doing undefined plus 1, which of course is just nan, right? And I get nan, nan, nan. Doesn't hurt a thing. It doesn't matter, right? It's not rendering. We'll talk about that tomorrow, okay? But anyway, right. So almost always we give it a value. There. Okay. And now it's my 0, 3, 4. Okay, so this is the key to React. And we'll talk more after the break on why this is so essential to React. So why don't we take a very short break? What I'll do is I'll take the attendance right now. And what I'll do, since we're all here, I'll just get everyone to, in the chat, get you to write React is state, because it is. So just type in the chat. That'll be our attendance. React is state. There we go. Look at that. React is state. Okay, in fact, when we come back, we're going to talk about why did they call it react? Let's continue on with our discussion on React state. And state, as I mentioned, really is the fundamental concept of React. So let's try to break down what's happening here. So we have our app here. And when we click our plus button, it renders. Our app renders. And every time we change the state, another render happens. Now, that's a real key concept of React. In fact, it is probably the most important concept of React is the render and the relationship between render and state. The two are tightly coupled. There can be no render without state. For example, if I don't set my state, what will happen? Well, of course, my button doesn't change. Let's ask another question. So, another interview question. What causes a render? So, what is a component? Well, it's JSX. What's JSX? What's a render? What causes a render to occur? Because we didn't call a render. In our app, we didn't force a render. We just call the set count thing. So what is it that causes a render to happen? Yeah, thank you. A change of state. Exactly. So that is a change of state, which means calling set something, set state function. We're calling a state setter function. So it looks like when I called my set count, that triggered the render. And sure enough, I click my set count, make my bigger, there. Rendering app, do it again, rendering app. Every time I call that set state, it triggers a render. Let's ask a really quick question then. Why did they call it React? Okay, let's do a multiple choice. Okay, we'll say a cool name, not offensive in any language. That's choice number A. Okay. Choice B, a Mark Zuckerberg fever dream. He woke up one night, React. We're going to call it React. Yes. That could never happen, could it? Meta. Yes, we're going to call it Meta. I'm going to vote B. I totally think that's part of it, okay? Or, of course, C, it describes exactly what it does. I want to see a few Bs. You can vote more than one, by the way. You can vote A and B or B and C or B. Yeah, I definitely go with B. Totally going to go with B. But I think it's a combination of B and C. And of course, the important one for us is it describes what it does. That's why they B when he's making that barbecue. Yeah. Okay. It describes what it does. And I wish someone had told me this when I first started programming React. It's all about state. State is everything in React. It's not just a side thing you should know. React is state. That's what it is. That's the core of it. This is why we have two, potentially three lectures this week on just state. We'll talk tomorrow. I think might be Nally tomorrow, talking about more about state. It's so core to state, and it's so important that we lose track of what's going on. Here's one of those if you forget everything else moments. When you write a function in React that does something, because increment, it does something. Every function that we write, no matter what else it does, must also set some state. There. Either at the end or the beginning, doesn't matter where it does it, but somewhere in that function, it has to set some state. Everything you write, everything, with some minor exceptions, everything you write will set some state. Otherwise, nothing will happen. Because what React does is when you change some state, React notices that. It then reacts to that change of state. That's why they call it React. It reacts to changes in state. Yes, exactly. Thank you, David. Exactly what happens. It updates and renders a component that depend on the state. Or technically, it renders the component that contains that state. Interesting distinction there. We'll talk about that in a second. So React notices you've changed some state, and it reacts to it by re-rendering. That's why the concept of components, state, and a render are just so tightly coupled in React. You set some state, React notices it, re-renders, which is, of course, runs the whole thing over again, doesn't it? Which means it builds everything new. In the case of app, this is all new every single time, okay? So we do tend to lose track of the set count. We maybe write to an API, set some data, load some stuff off of an AJAX call, but we don't set some state and nothing happens on the screen. You wonder, why isn't this thing rendering? It's because you didn't set some state. So every function we write, every action that occurs in React must set some state. In this case, my plus button. Okay, so that's what React does. It's reactive, but essentially it reacts to changes in state. Right. Let's build ourselves something else for fun. Let's make ourselves a text state. Put some here. I got lazy. Copy and paste always gets me into trouble. But I never learn my lesson. Set text, and I'll start off with some empty text. And we've done this yesterday. We're going to build ourselves an input, aren't we? So let's go here, the button there. I'm going to put an input. I'll put one. I'll do a BR. I don't like using BRs too much, but I'll use them here. Okay. I'll make myself an input. There. Type equals text. It's the default. So I usually don't include the type unless it's a checkbox because it defaults to a text anyway. So there's an input right there. There it is. And I can type stuff in. Of course, this isn't an uncontrolled input. I can just type it, but React has no idea what I'm doing, does it? Now, this was jQuery, and I want to do something. I put a button here, maybe. I'll put a button, and I'll just say, I'll call it, I have no imagination. What should I call this button? Do stuff. There we go. Okay, my do stuff button. Okay, there it is right there. In jQuery, I would put a listener on that button. It would then find that input, grab the contents of it, the val, and then do stuff with that val, wouldn't it? But that's not how React works. It likes to have what are called controlled components, where React is managing the component. And this is where it gets kind of weird, and we know this from yesterday. Inputs are one of the weirdest ones. We have to manage everything. So first off, we have to have a value for the input. We have to say value equals some state, text. Now, technically, the value is optional, but I always include it. Technically, you don't have to have it, but we almost always do. There. So now I've said input value equals text. There. So go to my app. Okay, and it says, oh, look at that. I've got an error here. A component is changing from uncontrolled to controlled. We'll talk about that in a second. All right. I start typing stuff. Can you hear that? Nothing's happening. And I think Andy demonstrated this as well. Nothing is happening on my input, of course, right? It's because there's no render, is there? I don't see any render, which means the value is always text, and text is empty string. So, of course, the input can't change. Nothing can change without a render. So what I need to do is to have something that changes that text. Let's make a function. We'll call it on input. There, make a function called that. There, and takes an event. Now, technically, every event handler gets an event, but for click events, we don't normally use it. It's there, but it's not commonly used, the event, so I don't need it there. But for input events, we certainly use it all the time, don't we? Now we know that I have to go set text to my event.target.value. The only one I know, because I've memorized it over the years, is just one of those things. Event.target.value, like becomes second nature. Okay, so now I can set up my listener on that item, right? And it's called on change, isn't it? So on change equals my on input function, which I probably should call on change, but it doesn't matter. Okay, there. So now when I type, rendering every time, every letter is a render. I think Andy probably mentioned this. It's just so cool to think that every time I type something, it's destroying this entire page and building a brand new input every time. Isn't that cool? Like everything is gone. Every letter I type, the whole page is gone and builds a brand new one every time from scratch. Okay. Because rendering app. So it's rendering everything. Now, of course, I could take this instead and put it inside an input component. Now, I'm making all mine in one file. Normally, I'd make these in separate files, but I'm just being lazy today. So I'll call this my input with a capital I component here. Okay. And it's going to put this stuff here. It's going to have the input and the button like this. And I'm going to return those things. Now, you also may see round braces. I've got one here, but round braces here. Okay. Let's make it happy. Of course, it's complaining about the must have one parent, right? These are orphan elements or orphan tags. And we know that Facebook, being the world's most philanthropic organization, does not or supports orphans. They think orphans should have parents, right? So we all love Facebook. So we have to give it a parent. I'll just give it a fragment. There we go. Put that there. And now it has a parent. Okay. You'll oftentimes see the round brace there, right? But sometimes not. This also works just fine. Oh, and I've got a text not defined, of course. I better put my state in here. Got my state there and my state right there. Okay. And almost defined other function here. And my on input, moving everything into my input component. There we go. Okay. So this works, doesn't it? Like, let's call my input. So now I've taken this and I've kind of put this in a helper function, haven't I? Kind of simplified my code. I'm just calling my input. Right there. My input component, which is the same thing. Okay. work exactly the same way. Now, you may notice that I've got these round braces here. Where'd they go? There it is. Or not. This works also, but this does not work, does it? We know that. Why doesn't that work? It's just plain old JavaScript. It's because semicolons are optional, and if I don't include one, JavaScript adds one. And of course, it's dead code. So you'll almost always see round braces around your stuff. Unless it's very simple, you might see it inline. Now, strangely enough, this does work. That's because the Babel transpiler, I love that word, notices it starts JSX and then completes it. So this does work, but it's kind of ugly. I don't like that. So I'm going to put my stuff multi-line like this. And that's kind of the more common pattern you'll see. Okay, there's my input. Great. And now rendering app. There we go. Rendering app, rendering app. Very cool. Let's start typing. Huh, we don't get rendering app, do we? But I am calling my set text. So let's add rendering input. Input here. All right, let's take a look. Start from scratch. One more time. There we go. So there's my rendering app. I'm going to put my rendering app just below that, just so I can see my count and comma count. There we go, just to combine the two. Okay, rendering app, rendering input. Okay, I start typing. Hello. Oh, looks like rendering input's calling a couple times. It's duplicating here, but yeah, hello. So it's calling rendering input, but it's not calling rendering app. And we talked about this before. Of course, it is the component that contains the state is the one that renders. Okay, so this input component is running, but the app is not, because the state only exists inside here. So it is the component that contains the state that changes, that is the one that renders. But what if I do this? Hit the plus button. What's going to happen? They both render. Why is that? What happened? I only changed state in app. Why is input rendering? The state's not there. My count state, of course, is in app right here. And I call it set count, but they both rendered. Well, let's think about it. What is the definition of a render? It is to run the whole function all over again. What's going to happen? Well, line 32 makes new count. Line 33 makes new text, which isn't used. I can actually get rid of that. Let's delete that for now. There. Don't need that. I think we're good. Okay. So makes a new count. Console logs makes a new function called increment, then returns some brand new JSX, a new div, a new title, a new count, new button, and a brand new input component. Other one's gone. It didn't survive, did it? Now we know that this seems horribly inefficient. Like to rebuild the DOM every single time, especially an app, we could have thousands of components that are being rebuilt all the time. That must be really, really inefficient. Well, turns out this only affects the virtual DOM. We talked about that earlier on. The virtual DOM is a bunch of JavaScript objects in memory. The browser only sees the changes. It only sees the H changing. It doesn't build a whole new input. It just simply changes the value of the actual input itself. So the browser sees the deltas or the differences only. It sends what's called a patch. So React sends a patch. It compares the real DOM or its copy of the real DOM with its virtual DOM, and any differences, it sends those differences to the browser. So it sends an E and updates the value. Actually sends HE. It updates the value of that input. All right. So it is only the component that contains the state is the one that is affected. Okay, and that's an important point. So for that reason, be careful putting everything in app, although sometimes it makes sense, but really only put things that really belong there, things that are global. We'll talk about sharing state in a moment, okay? All right. Let's talk about something kind of fun. Let's do something here. There. I want to now, with my counter, which I know works, very cool. And where's my thing? 5, 6, 7, 8. Input 2, we know that. I want to now set my state twice so I can go up by 2. So let's do that. Let's copy that and we'll do 2 set counts. There. Okay. I'm going to set count plus 1 and we're going to do it again. I want to go up by 2. Okay. Take a look. All right. Clear this. We'll start from 0 just for fun. And we get 2 4s. No, we don't. We get 1, 2, 3. What happened? 2, 3. Yeah. Got the same thing. So what is going on? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And yeah, 8. Why is my app not going up by 2? Maybe I just didn't refresh. No, it's only going up by 1. Now this, although it is a trivial example of it, this is an example of what's called stale state. And it is a thing and it causes bugs like this, like what the heck kind of bugs, like what's going on? I can't figure out what's happening here. It's just when the app doesn't behave like you expect. I have stale state. So let's step through the code. When in doubt, you step through your code. We're going to trace the code. So we're going to render our app. So first time we render the app. Okay. Now we've got our button here. We're going to click on this button and trace what happens. Click the button. Okay. On click, increment. It calls the increment function, line 36. It goes console log hello. Hello right now is 0. So console log hello. You probably see where I'm going with this. Okay. Then it goes set count to count plus 1. So set count to 0 plus 1, 1. It does again. Set count to count plus 1. Set count to 0 plus 1. So simply calling count plus 1 twice. It's calling 1 twice, doing 2 set counts to 1. React does optimize its state setters, so it ignores these. It combines them into 1. So I'm doing the same thing. What's happened here is count is stale. Now here it's really obvious. Of course, it's the same count. But this might not be so obvious. Maybe you've got a function here that, function that you give it count and maybe set count and something else, who knows, some function, right? And down inside there, it's calling set count there. Or maybe it's happening before this. And we can't figure out why. And all of a sudden we come to here, we set count. What happened? Why on earth would that happen? It happens when this runs twice, or you have multiple set states on the same state happening, and that really can happen a lot, much more than you think. Okay, so we end up with stale state. Very obvious case, but sometimes it's really not obvious. But fortunately, there's a really easy way to overcome this. And it's by using a different form of our state setter. Anyone know what the second form is? This is the simple form. We go set state value. Takes a single parameter. Anyone know what the second format is? Anyone read ahead in Compass? There's a second way of calling set count, turns out. Instead of passing a value to set count, we can pass a function. We can pass a function. Let's do it in the second one instead. There. Let's pass a function. There we go. One too many. All right. So I pass a function, and anything you return from the function sets the state. So you have to go return something. Count plus 1. Oops. +1. Well, how about that? Didn't work. So, but there's one more feature of this. As a parameter, it gives you the last thing that was saved. So I'd go prev +1. And this is guaranteed to be the latest and greatest, most up-to-date version of your count. In this case, it's my prev. Now, it does exactly what I want, 2468. So remember this, if you're getting some funny bugs, you just can't figure what the heck is going on with this thing. It might be because you have some stale state. And we get around that by simply doing this. Okay. Let's do one more thing with our state. And by the way, we can simplify this. You'll oftentimes see this instead with no return and no curly braces and no braces at all. You'll see it done that way because it's very simple. And you don't have to do it if it's not stale. You can call it every time. Some people like to always call their set state this way. Totally works the same way. No penalty. But if you know for sure there's only going to be one, you can always start with your count +1. It doesn't hurt. But if you notice you're getting some weird bugs happening, not a bad idea to use the prep version. Right. Put that back. Do something else. Let's make ourselves a list. I love lists in React. That is so cool. Even more cool than inputs, which are pretty cool. Let's make ourselves, I'm going to make ourselves a list here. Const, I'll call it list. Come on. And set list equals use state. And we're going to go with an array. Initialize an array in our code. Okay. And I want to render this list. Now, I don't add too many spoilers for tomorrow, so I got to be careful. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make some test data, make some stuff here. Let's make a list. Let's put it up here. There. Const, we'll call it test data equals an array of strings. Item 1, comma, yeah, just 5 random strings. There we go with our commas. There. So there's some test data. The reason I'm doing this is I don't want to spoil tomorrow's lecture because we talk about how to handle arrays properly. Okay. And I'm going to, when someone clicks that button, I'm going to have it populate or show the items down below here. So I want to render a list. So I'll put my list probably, make another BR, and I'll make a UL. There. And I want to render some list. I'm going to call it my item list, which means I need a variable. So I'm going to go here and make myself an item list right here. Okay, so const item list equals. Okay, so I want to render these things a little lower so I can see it. There, put it down here. I want to render these 5 things. So I have an array here, but I want to render a bunch of LIs. In other words, like this. I want LI and item 1 like this, right, with commas. There. 2, 3, and 4. Oh, comma's the wrong place. There. This is what I want. And when I render that, I get my items, don't I? Because we know one of the really cool features of React is it auto expands arrays, doesn't it? I love that feature. Remember Tweeter? We had to do for tweet of tweets, create tweet element, and then append the tweet. But React auto expands arrays. In fact, if I just give it an array here, let's give it const array equals 1, 2, 3, 4, and I render the array, it just expands it. Put it, where should I put it? Put it right here. Put my array right there. It just expands the array. There, like that. It's really cool. I love the way it does that auto expansion of arrays. Okay. So it takes my item list and simply expands it into 4 items. So this is what I want as an array. This is what I've got. So we know there is a ready-made function in JavaScript that does exactly. It takes an array that you've got and turns it into an array that you want. That is called, of course, everyone, the React developer's best friend. Yes, map. It is our best friend as React developers. Wrap. So item list equals my test data dot map. And for every item, I'm going to return, I do inline, an li with the item in it. There. And well, it looks the same, except it has the word item. Did I forget something? Looks like I did. Curly braces. Okay. And there we go. So this is how it works. So what I can do now instead is I can go, I'm going to map my list. Oh, wrong place. Take my list out of here and put it in here. I'm going to render my list instead. List.map. There. Now it's an empty list. When I press my do stuff, I want to populate my data. So I need an on click on that do stuff. So my do stuff button. Oh, that's my other button. Let's take this button there. Take this down here. Put it. I'll put it here. How's that going to look? Well, same thing. Okay, so on click equals, and I want to call a function. Now, there's always the debate, should I give it a named function or should I make the function inline? Okay, I tend to, when I start out and start learning React, I tend to make named functions because they're just so easier. So I'll call my function and I'll call it do stuff. Okay, so I'm going to call my do stuff function when I click that button, do stuff, right? And what I want to do is I want to save or set my list to my test data. So set list to my test data. So when I click the button, it should set my list, and it works. Let's make another button. Just fun. Let's make ourselves a clear button. And I can make a function, but this is so simple. I'm going to do it inline. Let's make a function where I'm going to set my list to an empty array, like that. And this also works. Okay, and I clear, and that works. So do stuff and clear. So the question is, well, should I use a named function or inline? And the question is, well, if it's really simple stuff like this, it doesn't hurt to do that. But if you find that a little confusing, make a function. Just make a function called clear and call it. Okay. There are some times, however, where we absolutely cannot use a named function. We have to do it this way. And those are cases where you need to pass a parameter, some variable here that only exists in some context here. In other words, in this case, my clear, my do stuff function here takes no parameters. When I call onClick, that's being called by this button, isn't it? In other words, the DOM is generating the event, and I get an onClick event, and I get what as a parameter? Well, I get event. Okay, I get event. But if my increment function needed something else, like value, well, now I can't call it directly this way because it needs a value here. So the answer is, if your function needs something other than nothing, in this case, do stuff needs nothing, okay? We treat event basically like nothing. It doesn't need it. But there are some cases to come across where you actually have to call this because you need to pass it a different parameter. In this case, I'm passing it set list this way. Now, this will become more obvious when we start doing the photo labs exercise. We have a loop. We do a loop and we build stuff. One thing we should try to avoid, please don't do this. And this, by the way, this works. You can do this. You can take this and put that right inside there. Take a look. Yeah, it should work. There. Yeah, it works. Okay. This works. But this is now getting to be a bit much. I would say, unless it's very, very simple, please don't embed very complex JavaScript in your JSX. It's not EJS. Simple little things, okay? Mostly variables. I see a lot of people, they do like multi-line stuff. We're talking like some serious stuff here, right? So maybe a map with some, or there, multi-line, like this. It gets really complicated. Like lines and lines of code, 20, 30 lines inside their template. Try to keep your template clean, okay? If it's anything more complex than like that, this should probably be a variable. Do it outside of your return. Think of it like a Broadway play or some kind of production where you get everything ready here. All your stuff is here. Then you simply plug them in there. There. This is like Showtime. This is the render, right? This is what ends up on the browser. So try to keep this as clean as possible. Simple things, sure, but don't go building complex things inside your template. That belongs outside here. And as a rule, the order of stuff in our component is usually hooks first, usually state is first, followed by other hooks. We'll talk about those later. Then functions, and then code that actually does stuff, and then your return. Usually the star of the show goes last, like the top billing, like the director, directed by, and then the show starts, right? Well, this is like the director, I guess. It's the main character, at least as far as the movie company is concerned. Okay, this is the star, and because this purpose is really, it's the main thing on this page is my list. That's the order. So hooks first, usually state first, followed by some function declarations, then code that does stuff, and then your return. And try to avoid putting a lot of things or jamming a lot of things inside your template because it can get really messy. I think Compass has some examples that does exactly that, actually. So try to avoid that. Make a variable. It just looks so cleaner. Render my item list. Okay. Let's talk about how we would share state between two sibling components. We've done this before, didn't we? Let's take a look. I've got a copy here. There. Here's my draw.io. Did you know there's actually a local version? See? Updates. I've got this running on my machine. You can actually download draw.io on your computer and use it. It's pretty cool. I think I've got the portable version, if I'm not mistaken. But it doesn't run, it runs without any internet, which is fantastic. It's also a lot faster. So I'm going to make myself some components. There's one component here. There's my app. Let's build my app right there. So there's my app. Okay. And what I want to do, I want to have, let's make ourselves two counter components. make one here. We'll call it counter, and another one. There. So now we have app with two counters. So now I could certainly just clearly put my two counters like this, and that would work, wouldn't it? There. And I've got my two counters. But that's not really dry. So what I want to do is I'm going to take my component, my counter component, and make myself another component. Let's put this in a separate file. Do it the proper way. Make a file called counter.js. Okay. And we'll export that counter. Okay. And we're going to take our state. So now all of our counter stuff is going to be inside our state. So we'll use state, auto import use state. There we go. I'll call it counter, just to make it different. Set counter. Okay. And now it's easy. I'm just going to render the same things. Essentially, I'm just copying, pasting. So let's take my count and my button there. So return fragment and my count and my button. Great. I need my increment function. So let me grab that. I think that's going to work. Oh, set counter. And I want to render count. I think I've got a pretty decent functioning app here, or counter. Okay, let's give it a try. Let's go ahead and use my counter component. So there. Now I'm going to go pointy bracket counter. It should notice it's there. Did it auto import? It did. I like that feature. And I've got a counter. Let's take a look. And it works. Let's put a BR here. I do hate them, but they kind of are handy for this. Okay, or I can put my div. Let's make this a div, and that way it's always on a separate line, at least by default. Much nicer. Oh, dispatch. What's with that? Thanks, VS Code, for typing stuff I didn't ask for. Okay, there we go. I can make my counter. So now I've got my app. I can make two counters. There. Let's just clean this up for now. There. Okay, so there's essentially what we've drawn, our app with two counters. We don't need our counter code anymore. In fact, none of this stuff for now. Clean up our app for now. How we doing? Oh, counter's not defined. On line 32. Might just got confused. Oh, there it is. Okay, fantastic. Okay, two counters, just like our diagram. Now, what I want to do, of course, I want them to both share the same state. This is where I have two sibling components, or components that aren't on the same tree. Remember our vampires? We had to find out if things were on the same or had the same parent or the same ancestor. So we need, in this case, the state to be shared by these two counters. And of course, we can't because the state isn't each one of them. And we know in order to share state between two components, we have to find the what? We have to find the closest common ancestor, like vampires all over again, right? And of course, well, this case is simple. The closest common ancestor is app. And this is where the state has to be. We have to take the state that's here. In order to have shared state, the state must exist in the closest common ancestor. In this case, app. And that's one of those rules of React. To share state between components, the state must exist at the point where they meet. Now, if this is a more complicated tree, maybe it's off to the side, but In this case, it's just app. So the state has to be an app, right? I will have a lecture in a few weeks, talk about, there's another really cool way to do this, but that's much more advanced. Okay, we'll talk about context in a few weeks. But for now, we do it this way. So I need to take my state out of my counter. This state needs to exist instead in my app, like it was before. Okay, there. And of course, now my counter needs to use props and props dot counter. It's going to render props dot counter. Oh, there's nothing there. Uh-oh, what's going on? Let's take a look. I'm passing my props. Well, it looks like in my app, I don't give my counter any props. So I probably should give it some props. I'll say counter equals counter. And the same with this one. And I get a 0, but still nothing's happening. Well, in my counter, of course, this increment function is changing this state. If I take away this, well, now I'm going to get an error because this doesn't exist. So this can't exist here. Instead, this function also needs to be up alongside the state. And this is actually an important point. There. The and increment. Oh, hold on. Let's put this back down for now. There. Okay. So what we need to do is need to have an increment function in our app and pass that along to our counter like this. So we're passing it the state and the function that lets us change the state. So now our counter, instead of increment, it's going to call, of course, probably guessed it, props dot increment. And now they have shared state. Now, trivial example to be sure, but it's really an important concept. First off, we always have to find a shared state, closest common ancestor. We store the state there. And this is important, we store the state and the functions that operate on that state should be saved in the same place. I'll talk about this more on Thursday, but we would not do this. We would never pass that function down to our counter. There's a really good reason for that. Would it work? Yeah, we could do it. We could, instead of this, we could say props dot set counter. Now I need a function counter to props dot count plus 1. That work? Nan, oh, pretty close. Counter plus 1. There we go. It does work. Ugly, to be sure. And we'll talk about this pattern on Thursday. This is an anti-pattern, which means bad pattern. Okay. I'm calling props.setCounter with props.something. In other words, whenever you see props.something function calling with parameters, props.something, this is bad. Something has gone wrong in your code. This should not be here at all. Okay. And so in this case, this belongs in the parent, which is why we call props dot increment. And also this leaf node, or this child, I think Annie's mentioned we like to have dumb children and smart parents. Remember that expression? I think Annie said that a couple of times. This is true. This child knows way too much about what's going on here. it really knows the details of how this counter is organized. It knows some secrets about counter. It shouldn't know that. It should not know this stuff. It should know that counter is some state. That's none of its business. It should be ignorant of that. It should be unaware. It should just call props dot increment blindly. And the parent knows about what that does. In this case, it's increment and increment. More on this on Thursday, but it's a real important concept. And the concept is really this concept of interface versus implementation. I mentioned I'll expand more on this on Thursday, but it's a big deal. And one of the biggest problems in coding in general, in any language, not just JavaScript, Java, C, C++, you name it, people make this mistake all the time. And they focus on the implementation. In other words, they pass set counter down to someplace else, or they expose this implementation outside of here. Okay. Short story is we never expose an implementation. We only expose an interface, increment, interface. How does it do it? I don't know. It's a secret. So as far as counter is concerned, it just calls it. What does increment do? Who knows what it does? Maybe it does an AJAX call. Maybe it does a data. Who knows what it does? But this counter doesn't need to care about that. The app is the implementation of counter. It takes care of it, and it exposes this interface function called increment. All right, everyone, that's our talk today, or our initial intro on state. Tomorrow we'll talk about one interesting thing. I'll demonstrate that right now. Let's do one more thing as a bit of a teaser for tomorrow. What if I did, let's do this. How about this? Just set counter. What's going to happen here? Let's put our rendering app back. Okay. So DevTools, clear, rendering app. I expected that. Okay, let's press our plus button once. Hey, wait a second. I should have seen a rendering app. Let's try that again. Hold on, what's going on? Hold on. I'm going to see what's going on here. Let's make sure. Counter. Okay. So press the page. Rendering app 0. What's going on? It's not rendering. Now, I expected to say rendering app 0 again, don't I? I'm calling set counter. I know I am. In fact, let's just console log. Calling set counter, exclamation mark, just to be sure we're in fact calling this thing. Rendering app. Yes, I'm calling it, but nothing is rendering. Okay, there's a teaser for tomorrow's lecture. Why? What happened? And this is a whole other topic, which we'll talk about tomorrow, which is called immutable state update. Sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't it? But that's our talk for tomorrow. We're calling set counter, but there is no render. So apparently, setting state does not always cause a render, does it? All right, everyone. With that cliffhanger, I'll leave you until tomorrow. All right, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon.